Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to take a minute to introduce Stephanie Zvan. She's a Minneapolis-based writer and activist. She hosts Minnesota Atheist longtime running radio show Atheist Talk. Her blog, Almost Diamonds, was chosen as Secular Woman's Blog of the Year in 2013 for her work to make the secular movement more welcoming to everyone. She's one of the organizers of the Secular Women Work Conferences and of the free thought blog Conscience, FTB Con, and it's all about science. So, Stephanie, without any further ado, come and wow us with your information about communities without churches.
So, this is kind of a weird topic, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to propose it, because this is something that we don't talk about a whole lot. What we do talk about quite a bit is the search for community, and you've heard some stuff today talking about why we need that community. You've heard Greta talk about having the support of a community during grief. You heard Tracy talk about people leaving their families and their religious communities and having nowhere to go. You heard Scott talking about how welcoming a Mormon community is. But for a lot of time, communities have been built around churches, and sometimes quite literally built around churches. You get a church, you get all the houses and the development directly around that church because that is the center of community life. Obviously, as we're atheists, that doesn't work for us. However, we still recognize that there are significant social and economic benefits to being within a community. Social support is very important for most people. Economic benefits of community come from the fact that, for the most part, we don't all fall on hard times at the same time, which means that when we do, we can support each other. That's great. Leaving the church for a lot of people, however, means that they are also forced to leave those religious communities. So as atheists, we have a vested interest in making good, welcoming, solid communities. It makes accepting our own atheism easier because facing the possibility of being ejected from religious communities is less scary when there's someplace else to go. Strong communities also offer support when families stop doing that, which, again, really important sometimes for people who leave religion. Also, and we don't talk about this, I think, enough, although that may be my perspective as an activist, good, solid communities make a very strong base for activism. When you have a bunch of people already together, working together, or used to working together, it's much easier to get them to take, for example, political action together. Now, whenever we talk about how important community is, I knew Greta was going to laugh at that slide. You always get somebody who says, I don't need any community. And I'm telling you this because I don't care about your opinion. Or something like that. I've never quite followed the logic, but there's always somebody who insists that everybody around them needs to know that they don't need community. Although I have always tried not to be one of the people who insisted to others and told others that I didn't need an atheist community. For a long time, I kind of felt like I didn't need an atheist community, in part because I'm one of the, in the US it's more rare folks who grew up without religion. My parents were not happy with the effects of being raised in their own religions, decided to leave that up to us kids when we grew up. They were a little surprised that none of us decided to pick up religion when we got there. But it was up to us, and so we grew up without a religious community. Eventually, however, as I was thinking this through, I realized that in many ways I was already part of an atheist community. Many of my friends are also atheists, completely by coincidence, and it wasn't really something that we talked about until I became an atheist activist. And they were like, oh, I guess we could actually talk about this stuff as well, so instead of just all being atheists together. But even more solidly than that, I realized that the fandom communities that I was part of were by and large atheist communities. Fandom communities actually have discussions every once in a while about, are we being too hard on religious people? Are they feeling left out by our discussions or the topics that we're choosing to do panels on at fandom conventions too unfairly alienating to religious people? And the answer occasionally is yes, not as often as the question is asked because that's how religious privilege works, but it does happen. Fandom is not completely atheist by any means, but there's an awful lot of atheism there, and the ways that it is organized are, in many ways, the organization is around non-belief, or at least secular beliefs. And so these communities have an awful lot to teach us as organizers of atheist communities about the challenges that we face and what we can do to solve them. One of the biggest lessons that I've taken from fandom is that building community is in some ways easier than we think. If you can get a bunch of people together and really what they have in common is that they like to cosplay as Marvel comic characters, actually these are all specifically just Avengers, and they happen to get along and discover that they have things in common because they put on the same kinds of spandex. In some ways, organizing community, or creating community is easier than we think. And I mean, when you think about the fact that people will get together and bond over dressing up as the bad guys too, this is the 501st Stormtrooper Legion. This is a group of people, this is a long existing organization that bond over dressing up as the bad guys from Star Wars. So how hard can it be, right? Well, okay, so at its base, community is easy. It's easy to get people to recognize things in each other that they have in common and start to build based on that. There are things about it that are much harder. And because fandom has existed for decades, they've dealt with these issues for longer and in some ways are further along than we are, which is why I want to bring this in. So there are things that are hard. Building a community that doesn't close itself off, that keeps being appealing to new people, and doesn't turn them away as soon as they get there, that's hard. Being a community that continues to meet the needs of its members as they move through various stages of their life, that's hard. Building diverse community is hard. We've talked about that a lot in atheism. I'll talk about it from a fandom perspective here. Building a community that is healthy is hard, something that supports its members, something that is good for the people within it. And that's one of the challenges that religious communities face. I mean, they're not always great for their members either, which is why an awful lot of people leave. So this is hard to do. And then taking that community and making it productive, getting the people within that community to work, that can be a challenge. So let's start with welcoming new members. Most of them don't start at this age, even in fandom, but definitely in atheism. One of the particularly difficult challenges in bringing in new members is the fact that many of the practices within communities that strengthen bonds between existing members can make it harder for new people to enter. So let's talk about a few of those. Having a shared language, talking in basically shorthand. I mean, we could, for over and over and over, use a sentence to explain what we mean about whatever. But eventually we shorten it. You know, it happens in, obviously, workplaces. We get jargon. We get academic jargon. We get scientific jargon. We get various kinds of jargon. That happens because it's a lot faster to communicate that way. Shared memories and jokes become language. You will get behavior that is named after someone who is known for that kind of behavior. Just actually, first question here, how many people have ever been to a science fiction or fantasy convention? So we're looking at about a dozen. So some of you might have the answers to these, but how many of you know what a badger is when I'm not talking about a very small, stubborn mammal? About 3 of you. So even within that, how many of you know what boffing is? PZ, who has watched the boffing Gzi with me at Convergence. So a badger is actually somebody at a science fiction or fantasy convention who checks badges, who makes sure that the people who are in a particular location are the people who are supposed to be there. So they're people who have paid to get in, they're the right age to get wherever. That's a badger. I mean, we could call them over and over, somebody who checks the badges. We're not going to do that. We're just going to call them badgers. Boffing? Boffing is what would happen if you took Nerf guns and made them into swords and everybody just sat around and wailed on each other with them. It's quite a sight to see. I don't quite get the appeal, but it happens a lot at these conventions. So within atheism, secularism, secular humanism, we have our own particular shorthands. How many people know what a faiththeist is or have some idea? Okay, that hasn't, I think, come as far north of the border as it is, but that's somebody who is an atheist but feels very strongly that atheists should be getting along with people of faith and frequently working with people of faith. A Gish Gallop, anybody? A few more of you. Yeah, so Gish, Dwayne Gish is a creationist who is known for justifying his views with incredibly long rants full of misinformation, but that take hours to explain why they're wrong. That's what a Gish Gallop is. So we all have a shared language. The problem is that shared language can become a barrier to new people. The word shibboleth refers to, it's okay, you can keep your hand down. A shibboleth is a word that was hard for outsiders to pronounce. So Israelites were able to pronounce them. They were able to recognize each other by the fact that they pronounced this word correctly. So I can actually, going through the room here, talking to several of you, figure out who's from Winnipeg and who's from other parts of Canada, doing the same thing, which is fascinating. Sorry, I love accents. When we have something on the internet, like this with these acronyms, we can put together lists that make it easy for people to go ahead and look that stuff up. It's a lot harder in person to lower that barrier. It requires a lot of attention. It requires knowing when your audience is just looking at you politely because all they're hearing is that wah, wah, wah from like the adults on Peanuts. And understanding when you and your friends have taken that conversation down that rabbit hole and everybody's sitting there going, okay, they'll come back to something I know soon, I'm sure. Because if you don't do that, if you don't stop at some point, people aren't going to come back because there's nothing for them there. They don't even speak your language. Laughter. Laughter is a great way of bonding for a whole lot of reasons. It feels great to laugh. We actually release endorphins. We relax. When we laugh, the person that we're with frequently laughs, and we're doing something together suddenly, and that's great. Jokes frequently work on an element of surprise. So if you laugh at the same place, that means that you guys had the same expectation about where that joke was going to go. And so suddenly you know that you have something in common with that person you're laughing with. Jokes reflect shared values. Jokes sometimes involve breaking taboos, which feels kind of daring. And when you've done that with someone, you have a bond. All of those things are great. They build community. At the same time, however, the butt of the joke is a thing. Jokes frequently target somebody. Who that is it determines who is welcome when you're telling a joke. A bunch of jokes are based on stereotypes. You're generally good with elephant jokes. You're probably not going to get an elephant coming to your community. But a lot of other times, you just don't know whether the person that you're talking to is affected by that joke, is themselves the intended butt of that joke, or someone they know is. And particularly because not everything about somebody that you meet is obvious, telling jokes that have a target can be really risky if you want to bring new people in. You may be trying to bond with them, and what you're saying is you're not welcome here. One of the great things that groups that get together for whatever kind of affinity reason do is they make spaces that meet the needs of the people within them. So if you have a secular humanist group, you may put together information on parenting as a secular humanist. In terms of fandom, we get anime fandom, we get movie fandom, we get book fandom, we get people who like to dress up. We get a whole bunch of specialized things that we can offer to the people in our group, but we start to do that based on who the people are within that group. So specialization is great because it lets you really target the needs of the people within your group, but at the same time, you can over-specialize. If you have a core group always deciding what you offer, they're going to be offering things that appeal to that core group. There's a tale in Fandom, and I was there, of a conference that had grown to about 3,000 people in the 90s. That was huge success. That was great. There was nothing that big in the 90s, and they said, okay, so we're a little too big. We need to figure out how to shrink appropriately. What we're going to do is go back to being a literary con. So we're going to get rid of our dress-up events. We're going to focus less on movies, et cetera, et cetera. And they went from being a 3,000-person group to about a 100-person group. They knew they needed to shrink, but they over-specialized, and they really shrunk. We also run into the danger of people, when it is that same core group, knowing what has always worked, which means that we get afraid to try things. It makes us less flexible, obviously, reduces our opportunities to meet the needs of other people. And sometimes it even reduces our opportunities to meet the needs of people within that group if they're not the people making the decisions. You want to take care of that? Bring new people in. Give them a chance to do something. Give them a chance to fail, because often they'll succeed where you think they won't. This is not something that we do for particularly the folks who are already in our group. This is something that actually is just a strategy to appeal to new people. If you have that diversity within your group in terms of what you do, these are all events that happen at Convergence, which is the big science fiction and fantasy convention now in Minneapolis. Happens the weekend after Canada Day. We always pick that for some reason. Okay, it's July 4th. Has nothing to do with Canada, but I was going to try. But they do a lot of things. They have parties. They have the sandbox where you can bring your kids, and they have lots of activities. They have 2 theaters, one where they do standard science fiction and fantasy screenings, and one where they just screen anime. They have a music room. So they have actually harnessed that diversity. They learned from the other convention that it hasn't killed itself yet, but it's still very small, even 20 years after deciding to shrink. They learned those lessons, and they really made lots of places for people to connect when they show up. Even this, however, occasionally has some unintentional problems. this is a little thing called the geek hierarchy. Some folks put this together kind of as a joke about 10 years ago. When you split up and you say, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, you get kind of competition for who's the best. And that can cause problems as well. That's something that you need to deal with, just to keep in mind when you start to see that you're specializing, because otherwise you end up with situations where everybody cracks furry jokes. Furry fandom is a form of anthropomorphic cosplay. Cosplay is dressing up in costumes. Okay, I do not need to define costumes. So people who dress up as anthropomorphic animals. And this is what their fandom is based on. It has a long history. There have been comic books that have had anthropomorphic creatures forever. Obviously, you've seen Bugs Bunny. It gets a little more specialized within fandom because everything gets a little more specialized within fandom because people are really enthusiastic about it and will take it very far. But watch out that you don't have a group of people who always becomes the low group on the totem pole if you're trying to appeal to newbies. We also run into problems keeping people who have been within fandom for a very long time. We didn't have this problem for a while. There was a different problem called the graying of fandom that we ran into. Then superhero movies hit it big and other movies hit it big, and suddenly everybody's interested in fandom again, which means that we now have the converse problem in fandom, and we have difficulty sometimes keeping people throughout their life cycle. I'll be talking about things here that look kind of like generations, but aren't. This, by the way, is an 85-year-old woman who was just at Dragon Con in Atlanta over Labor Day weekend. Our Labor Day, not your Labor Day. Who? Is it? You guys ran into the same, oh man. I'm so sorry. You guys should get the real Labor Day like everybody else. The riots happened in the US. You shouldn't have to deal with those. And I call them riots, but that's yeah. Anybody wants to talk labor history, we can do that later. But she's 85. A lot of times, if she just showed up at any event, she'd be kind of overlooked, particularly since she's sitting there in a wheelchair with somebody who has to push her. She showed up with her wheelchair dressed up as the Iron Throne from Game of Thrones and got a lot of great attention instead. So there are things that we can do to keep and value people as they go through life. One of the problems that we run into in atheism is people coming straight out of college. In the US, at least, we have the Secular Student Alliance, which means that our college groups are supported and thus very active and thus very excited. And we have all of these great activists who graduate and disappear. So when we have a transition like this, we need to think about what these people are lacking in our groups. In this case, a lot of these people who come out of college are looking not exactly to get serious the way that our adult groups are frequently serious. We come in here and we sit down and we have a bunch of you looking at one person up here, and that feels an awful lot like a class. And I'm not getting credit for that. So maybe that's not what I want to do. But if we pay attention, people want to socialize still with other young people. So if you have a critical mass of young people, or you have a group that is specifically for young people, you're more likely to keep them. They want to make a mark on the world. They don't want to come in after doing years of effective activism and be told, okay, so you have a lot to learn. Eventually you'll learn and you'll be able to contribute. They want to be able to make a mark on the world now because they've been doing that already. They have more time and creativity than money, which is one of these things that fandom is really good at harnessing. We're not. We need to figure out how to get better. And I'll talk about a little bit that a little bit more later. We also have this idea, and you hear this a lot, particularly talking about atheism, that online is not real life. Online is completely real life, and frankly, the later that you left school, the more real it is for you. So that's something that we need to get over. We lose people again when they have families. Some groups don't, some groups are already good at this, but a lot of them aren't. And we need to find ways to do things that appeal not just to kids, but to parents with kids. This was an event that a comics book shop put on for May the 4th, as in May the 4th be with you. They set up an event where you could come and get your picture taken in costume as a Star Wars character. But obviously, this is something that appeals to both adults and kids. And that's one of the things that I think fandom really does better than organized atheism at this point, is organized atheism looks at kids and thinks babysitting. I think in part because we don't want to do something like Sunday school. We don't want to do indoctrination. But we really think about kids as people to be put on hold while we get on with atheist stuff. Whereas if we have events that adults can do with their kids, because frankly, most people, and I think more if you're atheist or secular humanist, have kids because they actually like kids. It's not something that most atheists do because they just haven't thought about it and somebody told them they had to. So even more within this community, it's important to understand that people who have kids want to be able to do stuff with the kids. So we need to offer them events where they can do that. And then, if you want to have adults-only stuff, maybe put it after bedtime. Eventually, we hit an age where we're not done partying, but boy, partying is a lot of work, so maybe we don't want to do that every weekend. They get tired, they get tiring, they get loud. There should come a point where we offer quieter socializing that isn't everybody going out to the bar. And we should offer meaningful work. Again, I mean, this is something that eventually, and not everybody's going to do this, and people actually do want to party all their lives. These are not specifically generational. This is one of those things. But we want to have something that we can do. We want to feel like we've accomplished something at the end of the day. We don't want to hit 40 and go, damn, I haven't done anything. And then this is also kind of the point where we start talking about how we do these things that we do. Folks at this point kind of like organizing, and they really like talking about organizing. And we have not been presenting people a lot of opportunities to really talk about how to do that. Fandom has things that they call SMOFCon and JOFCon, where people get together. A SMOF is a secret master of fandom. It's kind of a joking, serious label, because these are the people who actually get together and run events. And so eventually they got together and they ran an event for them to get together, to talk about running events. Because at this point in their life, that's fun. And I actually just ran one of those events, not for fandom, but the Secular Women Work Conference is actually a conference about and for activism. So not everybody's going to want to come to that. But there are people who are going to want to. Keeping them in place is a good thing. We have to figure out how to keep people in communities when there is strife. We don't necessarily want to keep everybody, and I'll get to that in a minute, but we have to figure out how to handle people not getting along. We have to figure out how to keep our communities from breaking up when relationships within those communities, and that means friendships, as well as things like marriages, break up, so that we don't have to keep splitting endlessly into groups when people don't get along. You want to beware the geek social fallacies, and I will bring those up specifically in a little bit. We have to figure out how to continue to value people as they age into what are increasingly invisible times of life. This happened a lot, at least in the US, with the advent of kind of new atheism. There have been people who have been organizing as atheists for decades. And then 9/11 happened, and a few people came in very high profile talking about this and got lots of publicity. And an awful lot of those people who had been doing this organizing suddenly kind of disappeared. There are a bunch of atheists, but nobody knows who's been running the show for the last century. And there's literally a century of history there. Okay, most of the people doing it a century ago aren't still around. But so if we don't figure out how to keep these people included, we lose that history. We lose their experience, which for organizers is huge. And we need to figure out how to document them being us, because we're going to reach this age someday. And if we don't figure out how to do that and how to keep those people appreciated, we're going to disappear then too. So Fandom, I will not tell you it does not have diversity challenges. It has huge diversity challenges. But it's been really working on them hard in some places for a little bit longer than we have as a group. And there are some lessons that we can learn from how they handle that. The first thing is we have to stop asking where X is. Where are the women? Where are the Black people? Where are the ex-Muslims? Because not only are they here, they've been here all along. And every time we ask that question, we contribute to erasing them. This is something that happens has happened with women authors for far too long. Somebody will say, where are the women science fiction authors? Do you mean the folks who were writing in the pulp periodicals in the 30s? Because they were there. And if you remember them, we can stop asking that question. Frequently also, these people are going to be your best sources of information about how to handle diversity because they have seen it all. They have seen improvement, they have seen what hasn't worked, they've seen all the challenges that are out there. When you give people a reason to show up, something to do, they do show up. For folks who might not recognize this, this is a woman cosplaying Storm from the X-Men and another one cosplaying Zoe from Firefly. These are both canonically Black characters. Funny how when you have those, people will show up in those roles. You want to make sure that people have something to do when they show up. People are not going to show up because you need Black people, because you need Asian people, you need women, you need the young people. They're not Pokemon. You do not collect them all. They either show up for their own reasons or they don't show up at all. And it is a fact that the more roles that you give people that they can see themselves in, the more likely they are to show up. Because just like the rest of us, Black people, women, Asian people, ex-Muslims are not monoliths. And once they're here, you have to give them reasons to stay. And again, work helps with that. If you're working, you understand your value within a community. And then other people also understand your value within a community. So if you really want to enable diversity, make sure that people are there to work. Not all the work, because this is something that happens particularly to female volunteers. They can end up doing all of the work, but make sure that people who want to work have opportunities to make decisions as well. It's one of the weird truisms of increasing diversity that the more folks you have from an underrepresented group, the more you'll get. And in several places in industry and academia, they do this through group hires. They bring in a group of people at once. This is something that can actually work both within fandom and within organized atheism. Just checking the time here. Okay. Because when people show up in numbers, there are lots of good things that happen. They have people to talk to, no matter whether other people who are already there get weird about the fact that they're a minority and don't really know what to say, and nobody wants to screw up, and that's a good impulse, but it's still uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of. They have more protection in those rare cases of actually dealing with significant negative prejudice, up to and including violence. It doesn't happen very often, but it is not an unknown risk for folks. And when they show up together, they have to worry about it less. And they also have somebody to talk to who understands where they're coming from when they have to deal with weird things. So bringing in a group of people together can really help. There are ways to do this. Fandom does it very well. A two-pronged strategy frequently works very well. Affiliation groups. So Geek CurlCon is happening a couple weekends from now in Seattle. It is a convention. We have conferences, they have conventions. I'm just going to call them all cons from now on, which is why I do this in the first place. So it's a con that is focused on women celebrating their input, their work, making a safe place for women to show up and not be harassed, to be appreciated, all that kind of thing. And it brings in a lot of women. Con or bust is a strategy that moves people from groups that have come together over. Con or bust is part of the Carl Brandon Society. Carl Brandon Society is focused on increasing the visibility of ethnic minorities within fandom. Con or Bust is a project that takes donations for folks who can't afford to attend cons and pays their attendance. So basically, Con or Bust is a scholarship program. So we have the one prong where we have groups that are bringing people together over a shared minority identity and experience. And we have other groups that are bringing those people then out into greater fandom. And combined, these are actually doing some good. Talk briefly about healthy communities. The need for community is so strong that you don't want to assume that everybody who is showing up is going to take care of themselves in the process. The drive, a little less so now, but back particularly in the 80s and 90s, to get together with your fellow geeks was so strong that people at conferences would drive for 12 hours, stay in a hotel without a hotel room, sleep in a chair when they needed to, but mostly not sleep, not shower, eat out of the con suite, which is just a place with mostly snacks, not real food, and then go home completely exhausted at the end of that. The banner that you see there represents the 6-2-1 rule. It seems obvious, but people actually had to be told, no, if you're coming to this, in order to take care of yourself, you need 6 hours of sleep every night. You need 2 solid meals a day. And yes, you need a hot shower. Every day, 6-2-1. And the drive for atheist community may not result in exactly these problems, but don't assume that people won't hurt themselves to get there. Make sure folks are taken care of if they're showing up for your events. In part also because we're dealing with a lot of young people whose families aren't going to support them. Sometimes we do actually stand in for parents, not necessarily of minors, but oftentimes of people who haven't been raised to take care of and value themselves. So sometimes we need to do this for them. Beyond survival, encourage good mental health habits. encourage people to take care of themselves. We have a lot of actually atheist support resources at this point, and this is only growing. Make sure people know how to find them. Make sure they know how to find grief beyond belief. Make sure they know how to find recovering from religion. Make sure they know how to find their local groups. Counter religious shame when you find it, because that is one of those things that really makes people undermine themselves. Geek shame is getting to be less of a big deal because geeks have money now. But it has been a huge, huge thing for decades. We've had to deal with this, and that's one of the reasons we get together. If we specifically counter shame, unnecessary shame, that's a different talk, we're doing good things for each other. And sometimes going beyond survival means giving an opportunity to talk about the big questions. That may be philosophy. That might be getting together and reading a book that makes people think about what it means to be human, that kind of thing. People, not everybody needs this, but people frequently need that. Offer that to them. The geek social fallacies is one of those things that really gets in the way of us creating healthy communities. And these are largely ways of thinking about friendship and community that come out of groups of people who have been told that they're worthless. And these were set up for geek communities, but frankly, we find them in atheist communities as well, because many of us have a similar history of ostracism. First geek social fallacy, ostracizers are evil. You can never cut anybody out for any reason whatsoever. Again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. Friends accept me as I am. Kind of. But you know what? Encouraging people to do better by themselves is a good thing. That is something that friends do. Friendship before everything. No, not every time a friend disagrees with you. It's not a betrayal of your friendship. We need to get over that idea. We need to learn to disagree together, which is different from all getting along. But we need to figure out how to be in communities of people we disagree with, because while we may agree on the God question, there are going to be other things that even as good people we disagree on, and we need to figure out how to do that. Not every atheist needs to get along with every other atheist. We do not need your friends to be my friends. That's okay. You can have those friends. You can have me as a friend. We do not need to all come together in a group in order to be valid. Some distance is a good thing. And no, we don't need to do everything together. The no asshole rule, coming back to that ostracizers are evil, is a book that I recommend folks read, because we need to learn how to deal with assholes. And in this case, there are two tests for what asshole means specifically within this context. Robert Sutton is an organizational psychologist. He's talking about what people who, by their bad behavior, undermine how communities function together. We all do some of these things sometimes. We're talking about a strong pattern of behavior. So test one, after talking to the alleged asshole, does the person who was talking to them feel oppressed, humiliated, de-energized, belittled? Are people does this person tear other people down consistently? Test two, does the alleged asshole aim his or her venom at people who are less powerful? Basically, is this somebody who can choose when they do this behavior? Because obviously, if they're only doing it to people who are less powerful than them, they have the opportunity to change. They don't always have to do this. But this is something that they get something out of. And assholes are bad for communities. They're bad for the individuals within the communities. They stop productivity. Because if you don't feel very good about what you're doing, or even who you are, you do less. They make people feel bad about the community itself because it can't even handle this person within its midst. Sometimes, and again, you probably have to actually document the problem and argue about it for a while, but sometimes there is somebody who actually needs to be checked out for the good of the community. Ways that you can stop the abuse: having a vision for what the community wants to be, focusing on who you are and what you want to do, having a process for reporting this, making that process known. Thank you for having a harassment policy here. Keeping records, because as we said, everybody gets to that point every once in a while where they're a jerk to somebody. But when it's an asshole, this is a repeated process. And that comes out when you keep records. Oh, look, you did it last month. You did it 2 weeks ago. You did it now. You just keep doing this. And we can show that that happens. Need to set expectations for change. Obviously, if somebody is only an asshole sometimes, they have the option to change. If they don't, then it's time to get rid of them. Finally, talking about making productive communities, turning your community into something that actually gets work done. There is remarkable creativity out there. This particular boat, by the way, is built on top of a car or truck chassis. This was in the Dragon Con parade. This is not actually a pirate boat. Somebody built this so that they could ride it in a 1-hour parade in Atlanta for 1 day out of a year. That's a lot of work, but it was a creative endeavor, and people will do an awful lot of work if you give them an opportunity to exercise their creativity. So you really just need to give them a place to do it. You need to give them a place to show it off. One thing about creativity, though, it doesn't necessarily have bounds unless you give them. So you want to probably set some expectations for that ahead of time if there are ways that creativity can cause problems for you. Similarly, giving people space to improvise. When you put on an event, particularly at Convergence, this banner is for the Skeptic Space Lab. Convergence has parties. You saw a sign for those earlier. Both Free Thought Blogs and Skeptics have party rooms there. Last year, Skeptic started by doing science demos in their room during the day because the parties are only in the evening, bringing in lots of kids to learn about science. Because they had this space that was already there. This year, Free Thought Blogs started doing salons where we talked about things like actual ethics in video games and talking about shame. So this lets you bring in outside expertise, bring in outside energy, organize less but offer more. So if you give people space, they will build on what you have already built. Obviously, volunteers. This is not something we're completely unaware of in organized atheism. People want to give back. Let them. One of the ways that you can do that is by breaking tasks into small commitments so that your volunteers aren't doing everything, or one volunteer isn't doing everything. It gets you more volunteers, which actually, once you get them in, they tend to be willing to do more, but give them something small to start with. And then recognize those volunteers. And what that means completely depends on your community. Although food is always good, feeding your volunteers never goes wrong until you feed them something they're allergic to, so don't do that. But something that makes the event memorable for them. So in this case, this was a t-shirt design for Convergence in 2014 on the bottom with, the design is a little hard to see here, but it's a variation on the helping hands from Labyrinth, if folks remember that. With the girl in the middle being the robot mascot from Convergence. Give people an ownership stake. Help give them opportunities to decide what it is that they're going to work on. I talk a lot about expanding ownership stake through fandom, because that is really how fandom has gotten to be as huge as it is. It isn't just the people who write the stuff. It isn't just the people who make the movies. It is, in a lot of cases, the folks who write fan fiction, the folks who do costuming, the folks who come in and throw that party and then decide to do something with the room when they should probably be sleeping because they're going to do it again the next night. But that's a different talk. So give people an opportunity to decide where you go. And obviously that creates its own challenges. But it is one of those things that really motivates people to give back. It's giving a sense. And it's one of the fastest ways to demotivate people is to tell them, well, yes, you can volunteer, but we're not going to listen to anything you have to say. Also, watch out for burnout. Greta has a great talk on this, but there are things that as a community we can do to prevent burnout. We can create a culture where you are not letting people down if you have to take some time off. We can create a culture in which we hope that everybody contributes, which means that we don't have just one or two people who all the work falls on. We can work smarter, which is not the corporate idea of work smarter, which is really work more. Work smarter means doing things like, let's get organized a couple months ahead of time so we're not doing everything in the last 2 weeks. Because that kind of intense time and energy commitment is one of those things that burns people out. Getting rid of the assholes in the community goes a long way to keeping people from burning out, because dealing with every asshole is work. And it's extra work that people are doing on top of what they already want to do for you. And then celebrate the accomplishments. For example, everybody who worked on this conference, do something when it's okay. Give yourself a week to sleep, and then do something to celebrate the fact that you put on a successful conference, because at this point we're at the end of day one and you guys have succeeded. So that's really my talk. Just get out there. Sometimes it seems weird, but just get out there and keep building community. And I'm told we have about 5 minutes for questions. What words did I not define that I need to?
How do you separate the, I don't know, I guess sometimes when you're debating tough topics, it's hard to tell who is an asshole, as you like to say that word so much, and who is, I don't know, maybe just a little bit overzealous in their debating skills, or they just really like to push people out of their comfort zone to think differently, because those people sometimes are important for stimulating a good debate.
Yep, and and this is a kind of a master level topic. So that's why if you don't want them within a particular group, if you have a debate club and you guys want to be no holds barred, you can do that. Understand that there are people who are not going to want to be part of that, but you can do that. If your goal is to be more inclusive, to build a larger community, then what you want to do is, tell people up front, that's not how we do things here. That's why giving them feedback. So, you've been doing this. This is a problem. We need you to stop. And then following through. Because the ways that we interact with people acceptably are very different in very different spaces. So this is specifically talking about building community. Your debate club, I hate using that term because it sounds high school, and there are actually good times and places to have that kind of debate. Although how much you're actually getting at when those people are being assholes in that case is questionable, because you're probably not doing a lot of discussing of the meat of the topic. But if you are talking about building community, then yeah, you set expectations, you say, yes, this means you, and then you follow through.
Is there a way to deal with an organization who doesn't want to be more diverse besides leaving it?
How do you feel about coups? Because in a lot of ways, I mean, those are really your choices. If there is a leadership structure that doesn't allow for a lot of input from the rank and file and does not agree that the group as a whole should be more diverse, you've got two choices. You either move up to where you are one of the people making the decisions. I mean, you can try to individually persuade all the folks, and that's worth some doing, but I'm kind of assuming from the way that you phrased that question that you would be at a point where you had already tried that. Then, yeah, you've got a couple of choices, because if leadership isn't doing it, you need to do it. And you can either do it within the group, or you can do it outside the group. And that's not fun, but sometimes that is why we split. And honestly, splitting is not the most horrible thing in the world. Splitting is one of the various ways that we let ideas compete against each other. Because if you go over here and you say, we're big on diversity, this group isn't, you are differentiating yourselves, people who want to support diversity will come over here and hopefully, assuming you do everything else right, which is why it's not the best way to test ideas, will help you build a more diverse, effective community. I think we had one more question. Do we have time? Yep, one more. No? Okay. All right, I think we are all done then. Thank you, everybody.